Good morning. Thanks for joining me. It's Fred in Alaska. It's a rainy day outside. I was gonna take you guys out on a trail, but it's too nasty. So what I wanted to share with you today comes from Tim and Joshua, and for many years now, they're in their mid 50s. They would float the Maclaren River down to the Susitna River south of the Denali Highway. And, they had little pontoon rafts with their oars and stuff, and they would just trout fish and just do their thing. Just two guys, no real set agenda, hunting, fishing, or otherwise. They just raft the river, and, they would pull out near, where the mouth of the Maclaren meets up with the Susitna on these gravel bars, and they've been doing this for years. It's just what they like to do. And so, approximately not quite a month ago, it was just this last June, about mid June, they were on their annual trip, and they would usually be gone, about 5 days. And, they would leave home on a Sunday. Josh, since our last trip, had moved out of state and had met a woman. Her name is Candace. They became engaged, and where Candace was from in Utah, she was bragging about the natural beauty, out in that way and stuff. And Josh said, well, you need to come to Alaska and check it out. And he brought her up. So we have Tim, Joshua, and Candace, and they get out there. They thought it was odd. There wasn't a whole lot of people, but they weren't totally surprised because they were kind of early, as they put it, for everyone else, because a lot of people go out there mainly when it's hunting season, and then the whole area is just flooded. So they raft, they do their thing, and one of the things that stood out to Tim was, he said the whole trip floating down, it's something just seemed off, like just totally off, and he couldn't put his finger on it, And Josh had mentioned that it had a more eerie vibe this particular trip, and they've done this trip, gosh, quite a many times. I mean, a lot of times, at least a dozen, that they could rapidly and quickly think of, probably a few more than that. So they get down, and as they're getting closer to the area where they're going to pull out and just camp, and then, they do their fishing from the gravel bar and all that kind of stuff. Just a great time initially, they're floating the river. Tim is on his little pontoon with the two oars, just man size, and not the big ones, just, small one person size. And Josh had his, but behind the seat on Josh's, he had a cooler strapped down, and that's where Candace sat, right? So they were a little wonky in the water, but they did just fine. So they get down to this area, and they pull the rafts out and all that kind of stuff, and they set up camp. In the same place they set up camp several times. They all throughout this particular area, this drainage, and I'll show it on the map, is, where they would pull out, and there's just beautiful, all the scenery around them and all that stuff, natural beauty. It was just one of their favorite places. So they get everything pulled out, they get camp set up, and it's, midday-ish, land of the midnight sun. It really, it's strange when you deal with it in person. But anyway, so it was new to Candace, and she was in awe. And so once they set up their tents and stuff, Josh is like, hey, I'm taking Candace, we're gonna go walk the gravel bar and search around, just look around, see if there's anything happening. So as they do so, Tim just stayed at camp. He was doing his thing. He was gonna do some fishing and whatnot, and he wanted to just do some personal stuff. He didn't specify. So Josh and Candace take off from camp, and they head back towards the south. They cut through a little bit of a drainage from overflow from the ice and stuff, and it was dried up. And they walk through there, and as they're going along, they come back around, and they're gonna hook back around. And just basically getting a lay of the land and pointing out stuff for Candace. And Joshua said, we got back to the back side to the south, uh, and they're parallel with the Susitna River facing south. They heard a scream, and the scream was coming from maybe 150 yards up into the trees, because from their vantage point it started sloping up and it goes up to 2,400 feet, rather quickly. It's kind of like a butte, the hill there, the mountain there. So as they hear this scream, Candace is immediately grabbing a hold of Josh's arm, like, what the hell is that? He said it was dual octave. It was very low but high pitched, and they were both just synchronized and loud. And so Josh was taken aback because, they had heard weird things over the years, but not quite like this. The other stuff they heard, he equated it to probably coyotes or some other mammal. He was unaware of their scream or their call. Left it alone, they were in shock over it because it was how loud it was, and it seemed projected at them. They didn't panic. They didn't freak out. Josh was armed. Um, he said initially he was just kind of like, wow, that was really intense. And so they circled back around the gravel bar. You got brush growing and stuff like that. But they get back around to camp. And as they get to camp, I'll pick up from Tim's side of it, right? So as Tim was doing his thing, sitting there at camp, basically, he was heating up some stuff to make a lunch and also to heat up some tea. And as he was sitting there, he heard the scream as well. But from his vantage point, he's facing the opposite direction. There's brush behind him, and Joshua and Candace are on the opposite side of that, south of him. And he's facing north. He said, out of the blue, as he was sitting there, he heard that scream. And after he heard the scream, he stood up and he looked around to, make sure his shotgun was right nearby. And he's looking and he's like, that was the oddest sound, because he heard exactly what Candace and Josh did, just reverberating around him, right? Well, directly across the river, he heard a very weird chirping noise, a very loud chirping, and it was not natural. He said immediately his hair stood up on end, and he just kind of slowly reached down, grabbed the shotgun, and was looking towards the direction of this chirping sound. As he's standing there facing that way, a little while later, because he said he was basically transfixed, just staring, waiting for whatever to make more noise, signs of movement, whatever it may be. And as that's going on, he didn't realize how much time had passed, but enough time had passed where Josh and Candace all of a sudden are coming back up on camp, and they see Tim standing there holding the shotgun looking across. And Josh asked him, hey, you heard what we heard? And he was like, well, I heard something behind me, but then I heard the chirping, weird chirping across the way there. Josh said when he said that, he looks over and Candace is really kind of freaking out. And so he tries to calm her down. Oh, we hear strange noises, no big deal. And she goes, well, that scream was real odd. They calm things down. They settle back down into camp, which was really very hard to do because, Tim said that it struck him really hardcore to where his hair was standing up, and he had never had that happen, even seeing bears all the time, And so he took it very, very serious, like, what's causing this, right? So as they're sitting there, he finishes up the lunch thing and the tea, and they're all sitting there talking in a circle on their little fold-out chairs, and Josh and Candace have their back to the brush behind them, facing, their backs are facing south, and they're facing Tim, who's facing back towards them on the opposite side of their little campfire. And, he's directly north of them, and they're looking past him on the other riverbank side. And as they're sitting there talking, Candace jumps up and points. Now, when she jumps up and points, immediately Tim jumps up, turns around. Josh is already, halfway standing up as Tim turns around. They're all looking, and they're not seeing what she saw. And she tells them, hey, there's something very dark moving over there in that brush. You can hear it. And so they stop a second because they're near the river, so there's other noises going on. But she picked up on the noise, and they listened for a second, then they caught onto it too. You could hear the brush moving, then they saw some of the brush moving around, right? So Tim grabs the shotgun again. Josh had his pistol on his hip, but he didn't even unholster it because, you know, Tim's right there with the shotgun. They listen for a while, and it goes quiet. Noise stops. Things calm down. And they sit back down. They finish what they were doing. And Josh took the small bowls and stuff, you know, and went over to the river to wash them out, you know, being bear safe and all that. He was sitting there washing everything out. And as Tim put it, him and Candace were sitting there at the campfire, and she kept talking about that scream. And Tim was like, yeah, I heard it, and it was very odd. And as they're having this discussion, they hear the scream again. But this time it sounds like it's directly behind the brush behind them, right? And so they're like, what the hell? You know, because, again, it reverberated around, so it sounded like it was coming from back behind the brush. That immediately got Josh's attention because he was just finishing up what he was doing. He comes back over and tells Tim and Candace, hey, let's go back around there and see if we can see whatever's making this noise, because it's creeping me the hell out. So they all agreed. Tim took the lead. Josh was right behind with Candace directly behind him, and they basically retraced Josh and Candace's path back around to the backside. Now, when they got around to the backside and Tim was telling Josh, it sounded like it was coming from over here. As he was saying that, right in the middle of saying that to him, they hear brush move off to their left from that little island of brush, right? And they're camped directly on the opposite side of it, right? So they hear this movement in the brush, and immediately Tim's pointing the shotgun in that direction. Josh draws his firearm, and they're looking and following the sound, you know, with their ears and their eyes, trying to figure out where it's moving to, right? Because there's a little bit of wind, but there's definitely tromping and crashing through this brush that's just right off to their left-hand side. And Tim said, let's back up, because he's thinking bear, right? And the bear must have been drawn in with the smell of the food cooking, and then, you know, the food smell dissipated, so it's probably coming back out to leave the area, probably winded us. Let's give it room. So as they back up, they're down the gravel bar a little ways, and they're looking back at the brush. And as they're doing so, all of a sudden, this dark figure, less than 100 yards away, takes off bolts from almost directly in front of them in the brush, bolts to their right, like a sprinter. They said it was big, it was kind of skinny, and they couldn't really, excuse me, make out much because it just took off. And the way it was moving, it looked real awkward, but it was booking, and it just crossed and went up into the brush, back up towards the sound where the original scream had come from, real fast. Tim said he followed it with the shotgun, but he was still behind it. He wasn't going to shoot it, but it was just a natural reaction. Something starts moving like that, you know. And so they watch it take off up into the trees. And so they all look at each other like, did we all just see this? And, you know, Josh he had heard stuff about the hairy man in the past, but it was like, you know, people just been out in the woods too long or whatever, seeing what they want to see. But after that thing ran across, there was no denying in his mind, there's definitely something going on here. So after a moment or two, and they're having a discussion about how fast it moved and how crazy it was or whatever, they retreat back to camp. Now, when they get back to camp, Candace says, I have a very bad feeling. I don't want to be here. Tim agrees, and so does Josh. But because of what they had planned going on, they didn't want to not be in the area where one of their friends usually picks them up in a boat via the Susitna River. So when they camped there, their pickup would come up and pick them up, and they would deflate their little rafts, and they would put it in their friend's 22-foot boat. You know, they had a system laid out to where they could, you know, put it all in there and just motor on out of there, you know, at the end of their trip. So they had 2 more days to kill for this particular trip. So their ride wasn't coming for 2 more days, and they were kind of in a conundrum. Do we float out of here? Do we stay here and wait? Do we move camp? They went through all these options, and they decided they're just going to keep camp where it's at, and which they later regret. So as all this discussion is going on, Candace said that she kept feeling like she was being watched, but not from what ran off behind them, but from whatever was making that noise across the river. She just kept sensing like she was being focused on. And Tim and Josh, they had said, because I brought it up, well, when Candace was feeling this, was there any strangeness with you guys, and they were just like, it was just seemed like a day, outside of the craziness we just saw, it just seemed normal. I didn't feel like we were being watched or whatever. So it goes on into evening time later, and the way they had their tent set up during that time, what Tim did was he went and cut a bunch of these alders and started weaving them in between the other alders to kind of make a makeshift kind of bushcraft woven kind of thing, to where it was kind of a barrier to the backside of their tents. So when they were sleeping, if anything came in, there was a quasi barrier, even though it wouldn't have stopped much. It was, just peace of mind mainly. And so they call it a night after that, because they decided that in the morning they're going to get up and just raft on out of there, and they'll just float to Susitna. Tim had one of those Garmin inReaches, and he was just going to plan on sending his friend with the boat a text saying, hey, we're going to float down the Susitna, please meet us, at your soonest availability, right? And they were just going to get out of the area, basically. So they tromps off to bed, and that night, again, land of the midnight sun, it doesn't get overly dark. Candace and Josh were having a hard time sleeping because Candace kept tossing and turning and was just really freaked out. She had a very unsettling feeling. Josh was picking up on her vibe and was real, he wasn't doing too well either as far as listening, and the wind would blow and they would think they would hear something, but then they would explain it away as the wind. Meanwhile, in the tent next to him, Tim, he's hearing the same things. Tim hears a very weird kind of gibberish sound, like someone talking behind his tent, behind that little brush wall he tried to build. And he keeps hearing it over and over, and it was in whispered tones, and he could barely make, but he knew what he was hearing. He was like, I know I'm not going crazy. I know what I'm hearing. And so at a certain point, he gets out of his tent, and he could hear Candace and Josh speaking. He says, hey, there's noises going on out here, you guys. So they all get out. They're, Josh and Tim are armed. And so they decide, hey, let's go and see what the hell this noise is. It's freaking me out. Well, the underbrush at this point is pretty dark. It's still real light out up in the sky, but it's very dark and, just shadowy in the brush. Tim said that as they walked around his tent, because on that side there was a small game trail that cut just behind this barrier he put, so they had to go around the makeshift barrier to get onto this little game trail to go back in there and look. Now, he says he doesn't know what possessed him to want to walk back there to look. It was just sheer curiosity. Now, when they get back around there, now grant you, they just seen this thing hours before run from that same set of brush back across and on up. So as he's going around, and he said maybe 50 feet down this trail, which was real hard to get through because it was just spaghetti noodles. There was this stuff interwoven everywhere, and it was real hard to get through there. They get about 50 feet back, and Tim says he's seen a dark shadow moving through the brush silently. He was blown away because they were making all sorts of noise trying to just get 50 feet, and this thing is just seamlessly moving from right to left, and he's just awestruck at this movement. So he squats down and he's pointing. He's like, do you see it? Tim was like, let's go. Josh, standing behind him, said, yes, I agree, let's go, I see it. So they start backing out, and Josh immediately grabs Candace's arm because he wanted to hold on to her, and says, back out, you lead us out backwards, we're going to keep an eye on this thing. And so she does. So she's just following the same way they went, 50 feet, and then they come around the little brush thing, and there's their tents, right? When they got to the point where they're coming around the brush pile, or the brush wall that, Tim tried to make, as a barrier, a scream reverberates through all of them, just sharp, high pitched, but with a low tone you could barely hear, and it shocked the hell out of him. When that scream happened, Tim emptied his shotgun into the brush, into the direction of that scream. Just boom, 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 boom. He let off all 6 shots, and immediately they tore out of there they were freaked out. They ran out past the tent. Tim is sitting there running in the rear, trying to reload his shotgun as fast as he could, and Josh had his pistol out, and they run out onto the gravel bar between where their camp was and where the rafts were sitting. And they were standing there because it was an open area. It was light enough out there, and they were looking back at the brush, right? So once Tim is reloaded and Josh, and they were all panting real hard and freaked out, and Candace was trembling and crying because it was just scary as hell, They said that scream was so high pitched that had they not had stuff in their hands and everything like that, they wanted to cover their ears. They felt it in their bodies, and so they stand there, and they hear movement back behind this little barrier that he had put up earlier, and it was just crashing and thrashing, and then all of a sudden this low groan that seemed to last like 30 seconds on one single kind of octave, right? That went on, and they're all just kind of like, what the hell is that? Well, right after that noise goes away and fades away, and they all look at each other like, what the hell is going on here? All of a sudden, that little barrier behind the tents, which was about 6 feet back from the tents, all of a sudden, all that whole wall of brush that he had tried to interweave together as a barrier just kind of gets pushed down almost on top of the tents. And they were just kind of like taken aback because it happened so quickly. It was very violent. It was just, all of a sudden this thing is pushing the stuff down. And as that's happening, they're trying to make out the figure behind, and then they realize there's two figures pushing the stuff, right? They freak out. Tim had already reloaded the shotgun, and so he starts firing shots. Josh starts firing shots, and all of a sudden the brush kind of quasi bounces back up out of the way, and then they heard movement and scuffling through the brush moving away from them. So they're like, screw this, right? Tim runs over to the tent because at this point he had just exhausted all the ammo he had on him. He had a satchel that had his Garmin in reach, extra ammo, and all his personal important stuff. He ran to his tent and grabbed that out of there. Josh did the same. And what they did is he immediately is using his cell phone with the Garmin in reach to send a message to his buddy that's going to pick him up in the boat. They do that. He gets confirmation the buddy received the text and whatnot. It was like 20 minutes had passed. Meanwhile, Candace had been like somber but crying, like sobbing basically, right? And Josh is of course trying to console her and everything, saying it's all right, they're gone, we're armed, we're good. Once Tim got the confirmation from through the Garmin inReach that his friend received the message 10-4, I'm heading out first thing, I got whatever they worked out. And so once they got confirmation of that, they just had their personal important stuff, and they went and pushed their rafts into the water and floated on down. Now, they got to a certain point to where they decided to drop their anchors, and they just basically sat out there because they were so tired, but they felt a modicum of safety because they're in the middle of the river. They got their anchors out. Grant you, the little anchors they were using weren't working the best, but it was kind of a slow drag against the current as the anchor was just getting drug along here and there. And they sat there, and eventually the buddy comes, picks him up, and once his buddy comes and picks him up, they kind of just tie the rafts together and drag them back up, and then up to Maclaren a little ways to where their camp was. Now, they were approximately a half mile from their camp when they floated out and then floated down. And so when they came back up with his friend came armed with one of their other buddies, and basically ready for whatever. They get off the boat and they go over and inspect the campsite. So one of the tents was gone, the one that Candace and Josh was in. It was completely gone. They saw no sign of it. Tim's appeared to be smashed down. The little fiberglass poles and stuff were all just broken up. I mean, he said there was no salvaging that. The tent had been torn a little bit from whatever kind of tearing or investigating these things were doing at their campsite. The one thing that stood out to Josh was that there was one item left from their tent, and what it was Candace's pillow, which was a very small inflatable little pillow. And uh, he said it was very weird because it was in her sleeping bag when they had gotten out of there, and then now all of a sudden it's just that pillow there, right? And so he said when he went to go and inspect it, it stunk bad. It stunk real bad. It was like a greasy type substance on it. It was real funky. And the friend that came, they were telling him what happened. And the guy is just kind of like, he didn't doubt him. He was just in shock, like, holy crap, And of course he asked, well, was it a bear? Like, the bears don't do this. Was it and they were like, no, it's not a bear. They explained everything that happened. And so meanwhile, they start deflating the rafts and getting everything stacked up and all that, and they're salvaging what they can and trying to clean up the mess while his friend and the buddy he brought in the boat are standing guard. And they're listening, and they would hear noises every once in a while on the back side of this brush where the initial scream came from, but no one was going to check that shit out. You know what I mean? They just kind of stood there. They took care of what they needed to clean up the area, and then they loaded up and took off on the guy's jet boat and got out of there. I want to thank them for their efforts in getting a hold of me and getting the information to me. A lot of it wasn't easy, just because of scheduling and all that, but I appreciate what they did, and I tell everybody as much as I can that if you respond to comments of your video, don't be surprised. You'll probably lose your anonymity. So just be aware of that. So, Tim, Josh, or whoever, if you respond to the comments of the video, just understand that you're opening up yourself and exposing, the anonymity can easily go away. But I want to thank them. They're both professionals. They're not just yokels with crazy imaginations or whatever. These are down to earth guys, outdoorsmen, been doing this stuff for years, and it really threw them for a loop. Josh and Candace are not in state; they're somewhere down in Utah. But I want to thank them for making that effort, because a lot of people, they'll reach out and then they'll share their experience, but then I can't get back a hold of them because it's almost like they get it off their chest and they're just done with the situation, which I respect it. I get it. But I want to thank them for putting in the extra effort, and also everyone else who's been getting a hold of me this week. I want to thank you guys. Thank you for joining me, and we'll catch you on the next one.